we'll start with the diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the capillaries. Oxygen partial pressure in the alveoli is 104, but in the deoxygenated blood, it's 40. This means that the O2 passes into the capillary with 64. It's interesting that the PO2 in the aorta is 95. That is because of the shunt flow. When blood enters the left atrium, the pulmonary vein has the oxygen partial pressure of 104, and there is the veins from the deep lung circulation that were not exposed to lung air, so they are deoxygenated with the partial pressure of 40. When the oxygenated blood reaches the tissue, it diffuses into the cells, and thus the partial pressure dropped to 40. Now we're going to talk about hemoglobin. Normally, 97% of O2 is transported through hemoglobin. The other 3% are physically dissolved into blood. The dissociation curve shows us how O2 binds to hemoglobin depending on the partial pressure of oxygen. We can see that at the partial pressure of about 50 millimeters, the affinity of hemoglobin only dropped by about 15%. This is related to the oxygenated blood from the lungs, and the affinity drops so little because we, as human beings, can adapt to different situations. At sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeters, but as we go up a mountain, the partial pressure of oxygen drops, and it could drop as low as 70 millimeters. If we would make the curve like this, we would suffocate at high altitudes because hemoglobin would not bind to oxygen. Because of our adaptability at different partial pressures of oxygen, we can survive. This curve can be shifted by some factors. If it shifts to the right, it means the affinity for hemoglobin is reduced. This is influenced by the increase in partial pressure of CO2, increase in hydrogen, which means acidosis, increase in temperature, and increase in biphosphoglycerate. When the curve shifts to the left, it means the affinity of hemoglobin is reduced, this being influenced by the reduction of the same factors. To better understand how hemoglobin works, we are going to take a look at how oxygen gets to the tissues. It first enters the erythrocyte where it connects with hemoglobin and makes oxyhemoglobin. It travels with it up to the tissues where there is an abundance of CO2. The oxygen leaves the hemoglobin, thus going into the tissue. The CO2 diffuses into the erythrocyte where the carbonic anhydrase, with the help of water, creates bicarbonate, which is eventually exchanged with chloride, and it also creates protons. The protons rise the acidity. Hemoglobin being a good enzyme, it leaves oxygen to diffuse into the tissue and grabs two hydrogens, working as a buffer and lowering the acidity. A small amount of CO2, about 15%, combines with hemoglobin, creating hemoglobin carbamate. These erythrocytes, filled with CO2, travel to the lungs. Here we have an abundance of oxygen which displaces the CO2 from the hemoglobin carbamate, and also the hydrogen from the hemoglobin buffer. Bicarbonate is exchanged for chloride and with the proton of hydrogen go through the carbonic anhydrase, which eliminates CO2 and water. The CO2 diffuses into the alveoli and eventually being expelled from the lungs. In this cycle, we have two effects. The Bohr effect, which we find in the tissues. This is when the CO2 rises, thus increasing the amount of hydrogen ions. This needs the hemoglobin to work as a buffer, so it leaves the O2 to diffuse into the tissue. And the other effect is the Haldane effect. This is when the concentration of oxygen rises, so the CO2 is being eliminated from the erythrocyte. The whole respiration process is controlled through a couple of mechanisms. First, we have the respiratory center located in the medulla and pons. There are three main neural bundles: dorsal, ventral, and pneumotaxic. The dorsal group is one of the most important. It senses signals from the peripheral chemoreceptors, baroreceptors, and several other types of receptors. It contains sensitive neurons, interneurons, and premotor neurons. Its functions are sensitive, integrative, and motor. The motor one being responsible for the respiratory rhythm. The ventral group is inactive in normal respiration, but when it's stimulated, it empowers the inspirations and expirations. Recent research shows that there is a Botzinger zone that could have pacemaker-like cells, which also keep the respiratory rhythm. The pneumotaxic group has a special function of controlling the inspiratory phase. The reflex that stimulates the pneumotaxic group is the Herring-Brauer reflex. On the thoracic cavity, there are stretch receptors, and through the vagus nerve, when they are stimulated, they communicate with the pneumotaxic group. The pneumotaxic group inhibits the dorsal neural group, thus inhibiting inspiration. In humans, this reflex is activated only when 1.5 liters of air are inspired. Another type of control is the chemical control. In the central nervous system, the brain barrier blocks hydrogen ions, but CO2 passes freely. In the cerebral spinal fluid, it interacts with water, creating hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Hydrogen ions interact with the chemosensitive area of the medulla, which is directly connected to the dorsal group of neurons. As we know, hydrogen ions decrease the partial pressure of oxygen, thus resulting in hyperventilation. Peripheral receptors also chemically control respiration. Most chemoreceptors are found in the carotid body, which contains glomus cells, and a few chemoreceptors are found in the aortic bodies. Because the receptors are only connected to oxygenated blood vessels, the aorta and the carotid artery, they respond to deviation of the PO2. When the partial pressure of oxygen drops, a receptor found in the glomus cell is activated, which in turn inhibits the potassium channel, thus depolarizing the cell. At some point, calcium channels get activated because they're voltage dependent, increasing the concentration of calcium in the cell. This promotes the elimination of ATP and acetylcholine, which binds to nerve receptors and sends a signal to the central nervous system to increase ventilation. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more videos.